right, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our 7th or 8th lecture in our series and our Pueblo Independence Day talk for the Friends of Coronado Historic Site and for viewers out there on the web. Welcome. My name is Matthew Barbour. Today I will be talking about religion and rebellion in 17th century New Mexico, and I'm going to share my screen with you guys. Share, and then we will put it to slideshow. All righty. So when we talk about religion and rebellion in 17th century, this talk actually came out of a question many visitors ask me all the time, and it's something that I think archaeologists and historians and docents and everybody kind of has a hard time explaining when it's asked, which the question usually is, when we say Pueblo Revolt in 1680, why did it take them almost 100 years to revolt in New Mexico against the Spanish? And of course, you want to give that short little sound bite of an answer as to, well, that's not really the case, this is this, but it's really hard to kind of succinctly say anything about the Pueblo Revolt of 1680 in one sentence. Yes, they revolted in 1680, but it's part of a broader context, a broader social situation that requires a lot of time to discuss and kind of fully flesh out to really understand what's going on in late 17th century New Mexico. So this talk came out of that. It came out of the fact that I need to be able to give a lecture explanation on how you address questions such as these about the Pueblo Revolt that actually take into account all of the different nuances in New Mexico. So to start with, for any sort of discussion of religion and rebellion, first of all, conflict between European and Pueblo peoples in the 17th century New Mexico is really associated with religious intolerance. That the ultimate guiding principle behind the Pueblo Revolt of 1680 was religious intolerance. It had to do with how people thought of themselves and how they chose to worship. And the result of these conflicts led to the status quo. So the events associated with this religious conflict led to the status quo that exists in New Mexico today. And really, when people ask, well, why don't the people of Santo Domingo, if they have cachinas, or if they have, do the people of Santo Domingo or Cayo Pueblo have cachinas? And if they do, why don't they show them to us? Why do the only time you get to see cachinas is if you go out to Hopi or Zuni? Well, a lot of that has to do with these religious conflicts along the Rio Grande. So we've got a couple goals today to kind of discuss and follow through this. First of all, we want to identify who was involved in this, in these activities. Who are the players? Who are the primary players on the scene? We're going to discuss the arrival of the Europeans into the Southwest and their early interactions with Pueblo peoples. We're going to explore both the Pueblo Revolts of 1680 and 1696 and conclude by examining the results of these conflicts in developing the status quo that exists today. There we have Oñate's statue with the foot missing. There are some caveats to what I'm going to present today. First of all, my work or research interest is primarily focused on the Jemez and Santa Fe areas. So I'm going to make this familiar with people, I'm going to provide a lot of examples. But most of the examples I'm going to utilize in this presentation to discuss religion and rebellion are examples from my own research or examples I've written extensively about. Secondly, I'm not going to provide any sensitive information. If you're looking for a deep discussion of Pueblo religion, you came to the wrong talk. I'm not going to give any privileged information out about Pueblo religion. Everything I discuss is going to be stuff that's been previously published as regarding that. And then moreover, I'm going to use some images to touch upon some talking points. And in those cases where I use images of sensitive material, I'm going to be using examples from Hopi, So examples, and this primarily has to do with Kachinas. The reason I'm using Hopi examples is because these are open examples. I'm not going to use any examples of spiritual beings from the Rio Grande Pueblos. I'm not going to provide anything like that, but some of these are taboo images among some Pueblo cultures. So that warning just as we start. Okay, with that out of the way, who are the players? Well, there's three of them in New Mexico that are essential for this talk. You have the Pueblo Indians or Pueblo indigenous peoples. Not so much the mobile hunter and gatherer groups. And the reason I tend not to talk about these groups is not that they didn't participate in these revolts in central New Mexico, but really when we're talking about the Spanish colony of New Mexico, we're talking about the peoples who lived technically inside of the colony. And those peoples were the indigenous Pueblo peoples, and that, as well as the Franciscan missionaries and the Spanish colonists. And we're going to talk about why specifically those two groups are so very different and why they're different. Kind of going on. So first, let's talk about Pueblo Indians or Native American peoples that are referred to as Pueblo peoples. Now, as I mentioned in other talks, and I can't hammer home enough, the term Pueblo person or Pueblo people is problematic. It represents a diverse array of ethnic groups, and they all spoke very, very different languages. But amongst these groups, there are some basics as far as religious beliefs that we can point out. First of all, there's amongst all of the groups, there's no delineation between sacred and secular. So in Western society, we really put a break, especially in modern day Western society, between and especially in the United States, we really do break between sacred and secular, what is religious and what is not. But then more importantly, amongst Pueblo people, spiritual matters are often diffused through a number of social organizations. And these can include moieties, clans, and societies. And not all of these organizations exist at each village. So in one village, for example, the division of most importance might be your clans. In another Pueblo group, amongst another Pueblo peoples, societies could be very important. And the things that we as Westerners tend to focus on with Pueblo religion are Kachinas and Kivas, but these are just two of the most easily identifiable, but two of many different spiritual elements linked in Pueblo culture. And here we have, the picture above is of, and I'm not going to be sure what Kachina this is off the top, at Hopi, and then down below the Kiva at Jemez historic site. So what's an example? So if we want to look at Pueblo religion, what's a good example we can use? Well, in Jemez, we can look at the list of societies. And I use this for a lot of different reasons. First of all, you'll see there's 21, according to Florence Hawley Ellis, there are 21 religious societies identified at Jemez Pueblo in the mid 20th century. You can see those listed here. You've got the Cacique, the Arrow, Eagle, so on and so forth. I'm not going to list them all off. One thing you'll notice is about many of the societies is that their duties or their focus tends to overlap. Also, if we were to look at the list of those societies right off the top, just kind of getting a broad survey of them, we'll notice what's the most important thing associated with Pueblo religion, at least at Jemez in this case, or in this example. Well, most of the societies, roughly half of the societies, are associated with rain. What does that have to do? That has to do with agriculture. So they, once again, looking back at some of our other talks and looking at agricultural ingenuity amongst the Jemez people, agriculture, rain, weather, those are the most important things to Pueblo peoples. Certainly if we were to go examine the murals at Cuaua Pueblo, Coronado historic site, we would also see rain and water and weather featured prominently on all of the murals. It's very important to Native American, especially Pueblo societies. and this is not uncommon. Most agricultural societies, pre-industrialized agricultural societies, focus upon weather and rain as the principal motivating factors in their religion. For example, if we were to look at, many of you know I've worked in medieval Poland. Perun, the chief deity amongst the Slavs, is a weather god. He's associated with thunder, lightning, and rain, storms. The second group is the Franciscan missionaries. This is a bit harder for people to grasp, or maybe not so. The Franciscan missionaries are separated from the colonists for many reasons. First of all, they rigidly adhere to Catholicism, and they're almost exclusively of European descent, which really pulls them apart from the Spanish colonists, which were of mixed descent. They're people that come from throughout the Spanish Empire. These missionaries are primarily of European descent, as in they are Europeans that have arrived in the colonies to practice their faith. And they travel widely with mission placement based on tenure and perceived merit within the order. They do not settle in any place for very long. Unlike colonists, they didn't come into New Mexico necessarily to stay in New Mexico. And perhaps the most important thing about the Franciscans for the outside world is they're in competition with other Catholic orders. They're in competition with Protestants, and they're in competition with other religious groups, including those medicine men of the traditional Pueblo societies. And a good example of how the Franciscans kind of differ from those around them is MOTOLINA. MOTOLINA is, or Toribio de Benavente MOTOLINA, was one of the 12 apostles of Mexico and lived from about 1480 to 1568. Really what makes MOTOLINA an interesting character is he's the one who took the debate against Las Casas. So when Bartolomeu de las Casas was arguing, was writing about the destruction of the Indies and the need to save Native American peoples, the person who he defended the Native American peoples in his own way, but certainly took a very different stance than Las Casas, was MOTOLINA. MOTOLINA argued that Hernan Cortez was an agent of God, so he defends the Spanish conquest of the New World. And key to the Franciscan doctrine, and this is a doctrine they would take into New Mexico, and his argument against Las Casas believed that Native Americans were to be protected. And if they were treated well and protected by the authorities in Spain and in New Spain, then they would eventually convert to Catholicism. MOTOLINA flips that on its head. He says God will protect Native Americans, but only after their conversion to Catholicism. So he saw the world very differently. For him, an indigenous person who practiced their own religion could be treated any way the Spanish willed. And if they were treated harshly, perhaps that would be a means of convincing them that they needed to become Catholics. And it's this group that MOTOLINA, this belief that MOTOLINA pushes about Native Americans are not protected until they convert to Catholicism, that comes in with the colonization of New Mexico. And lastly, we have the Spanish colonists. Now, the Spanish Empire includes hundreds, if not thousands, of New World indigenous tribes, as well as multiple African, Asian, and European ethnicities. And I give an example there. So you can be, your Iberian ancestry, you can be Iberian, that includes Castilian, Aragonese, Portuguese, Basque, those are all Iberian cultures. You can be Italian, you can be, all these have subsets. Italian includes Sicilian, Milanese, Roman, there's many different. German, same thing, depending on what part of Germany you're from. We tend to think of Austrian or High German and Low German, but there were many different cultures and groups within the German, what we would call German culture. And in fact, the colonists actually developed a clear a caste system. And the caste system, if you have to create, the way I look at this chart, and this is a chart associated with the caste system later on, if you have to create a chart showing what people are, because of all the intermixing, suggests that nobody knows what they are. They're a mix of everything. You know, these charts wouldn't exist if it was easy to determine who was who. Instead, they have to create an elaborate system to kind of classify people out. Now, ostensibly, these people are Catholic, but if you can imagine these thousands of indigenous tribes, these African cultures, these Asian cultures, these European cultures, they all had their own different religions or even different takes on Christianity. And so these multiple belief systems are integrated into the society. And some are hidden. We talk about crypto Judaism in some scholastic circles. And maybe not so crypto Judaism. I mean, the first failed colony in New Mexico was done by people convicted of Judaizing. But some are hidden, some are not. There's great examples of this in the archaeological record. And one of them is these HIGAS. These HIGAS were found at the Palace of the Governors in downtown Santa Fe, the very center of Spanish control in New Mexico. And when we find these fig signs, these Azabache HIGAS, you can see them here. They're a clenched fist with a thumb between it. But speaking of which, don't ever do this to somebody, depending upon which Mediterranean or Latin culture you're in. This can be equivalent to giving somebody the finger nowadays. So I want to suggest that you don't take what you've learned and go to Italy and start doing this to people, because it can mean some pretty negative things. But these HIGAs were widely worn by colonists all throughout the Spanish Empire, and were found in some of the wealthiest and most prestigious households in Santa Fe, in New Mexico. They serve as a protection from evil, and the actual symbol is not associated with Christianity at all. It actually goes back to Roman times, and is associated with a ritual known as the Lemuria ritual, a way of casting off demons and stuff like that. But this is technically illegal. Everybody did it, but it was actually the King of Spain, Charles, had actually in 1525 forbid the wearing of these things. He said it's not Catholic, it's not Christian, it's not good. But we see these regularly being worn by many colonists, probably as a sign of their own pre-Christian or Romanized, and by Romanized I mean Roman Empire roots in Hispania and in the Italies, the three Italies. These are very important symbols for these people during this time period. So we've got the Pueblo peoples that are not Catholics. They primarily are focused on at least in the case of Jemez, as we saw, associated with focus on religion, associated with rain and weather. We have the Franciscan missionaries, who are devout Catholics with a very rigid view, a tough love of Catholicism. We have the colonists, who are at best nominally Catholic, but they're also nominally Spanish. They are a mixture of many different peoples. And unlike the Franciscans, who came to push their version of Catholicism on the indigenous peoples, the colonists came to stay. They wanted to set up homes and families and become wealthy. Now, obviously, first contact is muddled. So it would be nice to say, yes, Coronado expedition represents first contact of Europeans in the American Southwest. But if we notice, it's neither the first nor the last expedition into New Mexico during the 16th century. Instead, we see lots of entradas coming in, or expeditions coming into New Mexico, discovering the land, interacting with the people. Spanish settlement came in 1598 on Juan de Oñate. Now we have to be careful and say the colony of New Mexico was officially established by Juan de Oñate in 1598. Why do we have to say that? Because there was an earlier colony in 1590. It was an illegal colony. The Spanish soldiers and officials actually came up and gathered the people who started the colony, brought them back, and they'd already been convicted of crimes. They were shipped off, and of course their leader, Sosa, would actually die in the Pacific at the hands of his Chinese slaves, a fitting end to a man who started a slave colony in New Mexico in 1590. Of course, interestingly enough, he wasn't convicted of enslaving the Native Americans. That act was actually perfectly fine from a Spanish perspective. The thing that got him in trouble is he was actually convicted of Judaizing, doing Jewish rituals, and that's what got him convicted in the first place. So just a little side note about how religion even plays a role in that. Spanish settlement in the Oñate colony was really concentrated along the Rio Grande between about Socorro and Taos. Colonizers were initially interested in mineral wealth, but the failure to find these mineral resources led to the colony becoming a territory of secondary importance within the Spanish Empire. In fact, if they had found a lot of wealth, the Spanish authorities probably would have cracked down harder, not on Native Americans, but on the Franciscans and the settlers as well, making sure that they all got along and that the infighting, the conflict we were about to see did not occur on the level it did. But because it wasn't the focus of settlement in New Spain, people were left to their own devices out here on the fringe. Now, if we look at the Franciscan missionaries, it's important to note there were only 10 Franciscans that came in the original colony. We're not talking a lot of people. There was more as time went on, obviously. Also, it's important to note that the Franciscans actually chose to headquarter at Santo Domingo or Quechua Pueblo, which kind of makes sense. If you look at it, Santo Domingo or Quechua is really in the kind of the central area of, it's actually that little diamond right in the middle if you look. It's a little hard to find it, but if you look as far as the mission sites go in New Mexico, it's literally in the middle of them. So it's actually a great place from that perspective to conduct missionization. It's also perhaps worth mentioning that the Spanish colonists that came up legally in 1598 chose to settle around San Juan. The Franciscans chose for their center to be the old 1590 slave colony of Sosa. They chose the same location Sosa had chosen about 10 years earlier to be their headquarters. Why exactly that is, I mean, you'd think you'd want to be getting off to a new foot in life, but like Sosa, they were more interested in being centrally located than they were in anything else. And really, it's spread across different ethnic groups. And it's important to note that these early Spanish missions, the effort was really financed through the production of trade goods, shipped south on the Camino Real. So these ventures by these Franciscans, they don't have a ton of money coming in to prop them up. Really what they need to is they need to make money in the colony, which then can fuel them starting new missions and expanding their operations in New Mexico. So it in and of itself is kind of like its own plantation system. They need to make a profit off these missions. So they're not so much different from the colonists, and there's a monetary value to the expansion of these mission systems. Now, it's interesting because right away, there is some acceptance. The polytheistic religion, which means the belief in many gods, or in the case of Pueblo peoples, perhaps the belief in many spirits is perhaps more apropos. I mean, it would depend. You could ask a Native American person that perspective, but their idea of accepting very different, kind of their democratic or spread out view of religion and religious authority allows them to accept Christ into its pantheon really easy. In fact, most missions were built atop of existing religious architecture, so they not necessarily against the orders of the tribe. And in some instances, such as this one we see here in the Salinas missions, HIGAS were actually incorporated into the layout of the missions themselves. So the mission would actually, the church system would actually include kivas inside of it as a way of incorporating existing ideologies. And in some cases, even the Cachinas, for example, at San Jose Mission, Jemez historic site, the Cachinas early on appear to be linked with Catholic saints. So they actually took the spiritual pantheon of the Pueblo peoples, and they said, this one is St. James, this one is St. Stephen, and so on and so forth. They connected them up as a way of kind of integrating the two systems, which is actually quite interesting. Now the Spanish come in under a system that officially is banned, but it's a system that actually shows up in all the documents in New Mexico. They call themselves encomenderos. They talk about encomiendas in many places. An encomienda is a grant by the Spanish crown to a colonist conferring the right to demand tribute and forced labor from the Indians inhabiting an area. They're often given as a result of military service and viewed as necessary to properly administer the large land holdings provided to Mexico settlers. So a New Mexico settler cannot work the land himself, or a settler anywhere in the colonies really doesn't have one Spaniard given huge tract of land. He can't make that land viable. He can't bring that under intensive cultivation. He needs laborers to do it, and by appointing a set number of indigenous peoples, or in this case, indigenous villages to support him, they are in essence giving him the labor base to make his holding successful. Now, ostensibly, he's supposed to protect his people. He's in essence, I mean, if you strip this down to its core, it's feudalism. It's absolutely feudalism by a different name. So it's the medieval system of Western Europe brought to indigenous peoples in the New World. And it has problems, to say the least. But it really starts to have problems as Native American population numbers decline rapidly. So the Spanish show up, and the Native American population really starts to fall down. It declines very, very rapidly. There's a lot of reasons for this, and we've talked about these in greater detail in other lectures. But of course, disease, migration, and warfare, those are the big ones, and they're in that order. It's important to note that the reasons for population decline, well, we tend to put warfare up the front. It really isn't. Infectious disease, the spread of infectious disease. Perhaps this is easier for people to accept now than when I originally presented this presentation. I think the first time I presented was back in like 2014. Now dealing with COVID, perhaps it's much more easy for us to see how disease can impact not only population but economy, and really mess things up more so than ever before. Migration, though, lots of people just chose to move away. So the Rio Grande got depopulated because people left. They joined other groups. They moved on to the periphery. And then lastly, warfare, conflict, which is really where we're going in this specific talk. Initial resistance was widespread but uncoordinated. Pueblo peoples, we're talking about very different ethnic groups, were hampered by their different cultures. They had language barriers. They had traditional rivalries. These are people that before the Spanish got here, their primary enemy was each other. And this included intertribal warfare. So not just across tribes, but intratribal warfare. Not just across tribes, but inside of tribes themselves. For example, the Jemez were probably most of the time the Jemez spent fighting each other. Villages of Jemez or Toa-speaking peoples killing each other. And that was primarily the focus of warfare in Jemez province before the coming of the Spanish. So they're hampered by that. They're also hampered by these people leaving, these people migrating away, and they're certainly hampered by disease sweeps running through their populations. If your energy's spent on taking care of the sick and ill, or dealing with the dying, or dealing with the bodies of those who have already died, you don't have a lot of time to make war. And of course, that war has to be on a small scale. But then lastly, Spanish military technology and the use of Pueblo auxiliaries proves decisive. So if one group met up in resistance, they often brought in another group to deal with them. And of course, we have a great example of this, an example at Jemez historic site, which is the Jemez Revolt of 1623. You know, the Jemez Revolt in 1623, we have the Jemez people revolting. They burned the mission at San Jose. The actual events themselves are kind of muddled through history, oral history, and the actual what happens becomes unclear. But certainly we can see in the Spanish documents a huge punitive campaign under Pedro Duran Chavez, which results in the abandonment of numerous Jemez pueblos. And by 1526 or even 1528, the Jemez people have been consolidated at San Jose and San Diego missions, respectively. We believe those represent the present day or historic villages of Gisela, which is Jemez historic site, and modern day, possibly San Diego mission. The earlier San Diego mission was at Walatoa, or current day Jemez Pueblo. It's possible, it seemed to be suggested by Benavides that the Tewa were brought in to help Duran y Chavez in his campaign during that time. We don't know necessarily that. Also, the Spanish claim that over 3,000 Jemez died in the revolt, so bringing up large numbers of casualties associated with this uprising in 1623. But we're certainly looking at over 50 years before the Pueblo Revolt in 1680. We have a large-scale revolt. In fact, in terms of numbers, this is as large as, in many ways, it doesn't include as many different peoples. But for more Jemez people participated in the Jemez Revolt of 1623 than the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. The reason for that is, sadly, there was more Jemez people in 1623 than 1680. By 1680, the population at Jemez is really very small, quite small by that point. That's true of many indigenous people. And most of these early revolts are very poorly recorded by the Spanish. The Spanish didn't want to talk about Native American peoples revolting. They wanted to talk about the successes. They wanted to talk about New Mexico as a land of plenty, a land where a man could go to, clear about this, a Spanish colonist could go to make a good life for themselves. The real change begins in 1661. If we will change the narrative at any point in New Mexico history, it really starts in 1661. And it happens when the custodian Alonso de Posada bans Kachina worship. Interestingly, Posada, who becomes custodian is just the title for the Franciscan church. So the head Franciscan in New Mexico was known as the custos, the custodian. Now these pictures here are of some Kachina masks from Hopi that were planned to be sold in art markets in Europe. Really an absolute tragedy, but examples of what he's banning. Now, interestingly enough, Posada had actually served at San Jose Mission, or Gisela, Jemez historic site, one of those missions that may have had these masks hanging above depictions of the saints. So I use these here to try to give you an idea. I don't know if the grinning ogre on the right-hand side, what saint he would have necessarily represented, but you could almost imagine something perhaps like St. James, a more militaristic saint being represented. That's complete speculation on my part. But in 1661, these items are seized by the Spanish. They're seized and they're ostensibly burned. The traditional ceremonies are prohibited under the threat of corporal punishment. You can get beaten, whipped for participating in traditional Pueblo services. So Posada really follows along the lines of Motolina. He puts that hard line, that line in the sand. He says, these things, I don't care what people are doing. The idea of integrating, to using me, saying that that's a saint is blasphemy. We need to stop this right now. So and for a little while, there's perhaps less resistance than you might expect with the cutting off of this. But that changes in the 1670s when New Mexico enters a huge drought. The rains don't come. And if we look back at that example of Jemez, right, what do most of those traditional societies, those religious societies do? Those peoples, these ceremonies and these groups were really there to make sure the rain fell, the crops grew. And in the 1670s, that didn't happen. And perhaps not surprisingly, people looked and said, hey, we used to do these ceremonies to pray for rain or to bring about rain. We stopped doing them and the rain stopped coming. That's a pretty hard thing. But more importantly, as this drought occurs, These Native American farmers who've had to give a lot of their surplus to both the Spanish and the churches are now dependent upon these peoples for foods to continue to live, because they're still required in the Spanish settlements, think of it this way, they're still required to give the same amount of grain, or the same amount, in this case corn, the same amount of corn, or the same amount of blankets, or the same amount of whatever to the Spanish. Then they got to keep the rest. In the case of the missions, it was even worse. The mission church, so the mission church at Jemez, for example, would take in all the grain production and then redistribute it back out. So in many cases, these European peoples, both the colonists and these Franciscan missionaries, are determining who dies, who gets to eat, and many die, and resentment builds, leading to the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. Now, it's important to note that numerous Pueblos, joined by Apache, revolt simultaneously, killing the Franciscan priests and then lay siege to Santa Fe. The Spanish and their Pueblo allies, which some Pueblo peoples decided to stay loyal to the Spanish crown, were overwhelmed and forced to retreat south down the pass. A good example of just what was going on in the Pueblo Revolt of 1680 is the siege at Santa Fe. The siege at Santa Fe occurred for almost, 10 days. Well, not 10 days. I'm sorry, 8 days. Let me do my math on that one. 8 days, a little more than a week. The Pueblo warriors, if we talk about this in broad terms, after killing the missionaries in their individual pueblos, they were supposed to send warriors to Santa Fe to kind of drive the Spanish out, in burning and destroying Spanish homes along the way. The Pueblo army, or the Pueblo warriors, and I do like to call it an army, because I think it clearly at this point is certainly an army, is equipped with European weapons. They ride horses and they understand Spanish tactics. The idea that gunpowder weapons are going to be decisive against Pueblo peoples in 1680 is just ridiculous. It's also important to note that it was probably pretty awestruck by the Spanish, because the Spanish forces that marched out to meet this army were probably shouting commands in Spanish. And across the battle lines, the Pueblo peoples that had gathered to oppose them were shouting out their own battle line commands also in Spanish, because at that point Spanish was a language they all understood and could easily could deal with. In the decisive thing, and we look at those images there, so we have on the left-hand side, you can see about a dozen of the projectile points, the arrowheads, the arrows shot into the palace of the governors, or at the palace of the governors during the fighting at the siege of Santa Fe. All those were recovered where the bandstand actually stands now in downtown Santa Fe, right outside the present day front of the palace of the governors, which may or may not have been the front of the palace of the governors. The palace at the time this occurred, the Casas Reales, which is a whole different story. But eventually the Pueblo peoples cut off water to the palace. The fight's a stalemate. The Spanish realize they don't have any drinking water, and that the number of Pueblo warriors surrounding them grows each day, and the Spanish just retreat from the village. Now, interestingly enough, it's important to note that while the Pueblo Revolt is a rebellion in many ways, it's noted that the Pueblo peoples allow the Spanish to retreat south and don't attack them again. The reason for this may have been twofold. One, they may have not wanted warfare. They just wanted them to leave. So this was a way of staying there. But even if they didn't want that, obviously there's obviously a notion that I think perhaps enough blood or enough indigenous people, even if they wanted the Spanish dead, enough indigenous people had died already. The idea that they were going to cause a battle that would lead to more suffering was something that they just chose not to do. And the Spanish do leave. Now, of course, that's not the end of it. If that had been the end of the story, this would have been New Mexico's second failed colony. So you have the Sosa colony, which lasts for a year, and then you would have had Oñates, which would have been a footnote. But it didn't. The Spanish came back. The Spanish came back actually right away. Ocherman, the governor at the time, attempted the reconquest in 1680. He brought up forces and tried to reestablish Spanish control, but ultimately failed. He was able to attack several Carist pueblos and cause suffering. There's no doubt that the bloodshed continued. But it wasn't until 1692, under this man here, that we see the reconquest actually take root. And some people put the reconquest between 1692 and 1694. Some people put it after the ending with the second Pueblo Revolt of 1696. It's labeled the bloodless reconquest. That is a terrible term which has no basis in reality. It was a bloody reconquest. But it was a slow process in which Santa Fe was reoccupied, then the surrounding areas were brought back under Spanish control. In some of the areas, it's important to note that some of the areas they never reconquered. And in fact, Hopi is one of those areas where Hopi was able to maintain its religious freedom. So a good example of the reconquest is, of course, the battle fought on top of San Diego or Guadalupe Mesa in the Jemez Mountains. That's the Battle of Astialakwa. I'm sure I just butchered that word. And for the Jemez people watching this video, I apologize for butchering your language. I'm a lonely white guy when it comes to trying to pronounce Toa words. But in the battle itself, the Jemez resisted. The Jemez tried to resist the Spanish on this. And if you notice, perhaps one of the themes we can come at through this, or conclusions you might take away from this, is that in the case of the Jemez, they always resisted the Spanish. They continue to resist the Spanish and resist and resist and resist. But unfortunately, in this case, they established fortifications on top of the mesa top. They resisted the Spanish soldiers, which came under de Vargas. De Vargas sent his soldiers out to form a pincer maneuver with the Pueblo peoples of Zia attacking the front of the mesa, and the Spanish kind of sneaking up the back side. 84 warriors, Jemez warriors, died in the battle, and the Jemez were forced to resettle with missionaries and provide warriors for future campaigns. A devastating loss to the Jemez people in that case. But of course, that's not the end of it. So even then, 2 years later, we have another revolt, a pincer maneuver. What is a pincer maneuver? Someone asked. Good question. A pincer maneuver is where you have your forces, think of it like a crab claw or like a hook. You have your forces come at it from two different angles. So the force you're attacking is in the middle, and they come and they pinch right on there. They attack from both sides at once, and hopefully they break the formation of the enemy. In this case, they're attacking a fortified point. So they attack from the very south and the very north. If they time it right, you can't put people, you have to split your forces. Normally in a fortification, if they're attacking at the south, you put everybody on the south wall and you kind of defend it, maybe a few lookers on the north. But if you attack from both sides at once, they can't block both. And then that's unfortunately what happens to the Jemez. In fact, in that case, in the Battle of Astialakwa, it appears that they got a cannon up to the top of the mesa, which was decisive. At that point, it was over. The Second Pueblo Revolt occurs on June 4th, 1696. It's poorly coordinated amongst the 14 Pueblos, so it doesn't really get the limelight of some of the other of the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. And it primarily consisted of Tewa, Tiwa, and Toa peoples attacking. And by that, what we mean by Tewa is we mean the peoples. The Tewa peoples are those peoples in and around present-day Espanola. The Tiwa is the northern Tiwa, so it's the Picaries and Taos. And then, of course, the Toa or the Jemez people. And interestingly enough, aggression during the Pueblo Revolt of 1696 is quite a bit different. It's not necessarily aimed at the priests and Spanish settlers, but oftentimes aimed not just at those folks, but also other Pueblos, peoples who they felt had collaborated with the Spanish. And many of the revolutionaries actually, we talked about migration. The Pueblo Revolt of 1696 is more of in many cases, more of a mass exodus than it is a coordinated attack. It is a coordinated attack in the case of Jemez. But in many cases, these guys just flee. They flee to Hopi. They flee amongst the Navajo and Apache. Some of them even flee as far east as Kansas, where they build, some of the Tiwish peoples build El Cuartelero Pueblo on the Kansas plains. In fact, the picture you see below is El Cuartelero Pueblo. Some people initially thought this was the village that Coronado visited during his expeditions. It's not. Based upon the pottery and stuff like that, and based upon Spanish documents, because they actually have to go back out and get them, and they try to bring them back to New Mexico during this time period. These are Tiwish Indians. These are Tiwish-speaking peoples from Taos and Piccaries that left during the revolt in 1696. They were brought back several years later. But they built a sizable pueblo out there, and you can still visit that pueblo today. I'm not sure how good. I see an interpretive plaque there. I'm not sure how good the interpretive plaques are, but bear in mind it's out there. Okay, next slide. Well, I said in the case of Jemez, they really did resist and acted in violence, and they did. They totally did. In fact, they killed the priests at two of their villages, Patokwa and Bulitsakwa, probably Bulitsakwa. During the summer of 1696. Interestingly enough, in this case, there appears to be, and in fact, this is a fascinating story to show how Christianity, even if they're rejecting Catholic control, they still think there's value in the Christian religion. In fact, in the case of Patokwa, they tell the priest, whose name's going to escape me, they tell him, there's a lady getting ready to die in the village, and she wants to give her, she needs her last rites, and she wants to confess and all that. And he rushes out of the church to go hear this woman's dying breaths. And unfortunately, he rushes out of the church only to be surrounded in the center of the village, the plaza, surrounded by the warriors who then kill him. In the case of Jemez, though, they kill that priest. And then they don't march, before they march to Santa Fe. Instead, they actually march east to Zia Pueblo and attack Zia Pueblo as a result of the Pueblo Revolt of 1696. Jemez is marching against Zia, who ultimately repels the attack. They viewed, in fact, the picture you see on the right-hand side, the upper picture is of Patokwa. In fact, you're looking in at that plaza, the ruins that are there, you can only see small bits of stone. That flat area, kind of mid-foreground of the picture, is that plaza in which that priest was killed. But up above, you can see Guadalupe or San Diego Mesa. Above you, that is where their earlier battle had been with the Spanish in 1694, which they had tried to defend their independence. Instead of retreating back up there, they attack Zia and they push forward, but are repelled. They go back up into their mountains, mountain domains, the Jemez Mountains. And the alcalde of Bernalillo leads in a punitive expedition into the Jemez, crushing all resistance and forcibly resettling everybody at Jemez at Walatoa. So they take everybody who's left in the Jemez Mountains, they gather them together and stick them at Walatoa Pueblo. Currently today, we know it's Jemez Pueblo. This leads to new accommodations. This fighting can't continue. How do they make new accommodations? Well, first and foremost, the more problematic Pueblo populations were relocated. They are pushed off those places where they were rebelling to different areas where they could be either suppressed or monitored. Spanish settlers and friendly Pueblos were given additional land, so new land grants showed up at this time. The picture I have here, obviously the Valles Caldera, we see emerging from this new world order, the San Diego land grant. So the areas where the Jemez people had traditionally lived becomes a Spanish land grant. Officially, non-Christian worship is prohibited. Unofficially, Pueblos practice what they want. Just do it in private and don't show it to the Franciscans. And through this, we can see in the architecture, Kivas shift from primarily being circular subterranean structures to above ground square domiciles. So buildings that really kind of look like any other structure in the Pueblo village. So they have kivas, but they don't really look like kivas. So if you're not looking for it, you come visit the village, you could believe to yourself, you could maintain the illusion that they're not doing their traditional religion. More importantly, there's an evaporation of Franciscan autonomy in the Pueblos. The Spanish settlers begin to take a more active role in the history of the Native American peoples. In fact, if you think about it, this is probably not how the conversation went down, but if you want a simple version of it, I'm going to give you a simple theatrical version as portrayed by the Spanish colonists. Look, guys, and they're talking to indigenous peoples, indigenous Pueblo peoples. Look, we aren't real big fans of this crazy ultra conservative Catholicism too. Hell, some of us are Jews. You know what we do? We nominally say we're Catholic, we go to church, and then we do whatever the hell we want in our own homes. We wear these higas to ward off evil. We don't eat pork. We do whatever it is that our families have traditionally done. And you know what? Everybody turns a blind eye to it. You just got to pretend to be really devoutly religious and follow what the priest said. That is probably what happened. And we see that in the modern day study. So today, it's certainly, the 17th century religious conflicts have long-lasting repercussions. We have the, what I'm showing there in those images, of course, fiestas in Santa Fe, and certainly portions of the Hispanic and Native American communities maintain a dislike for one another today, including specific Pueblos disliking other Pueblos. And in fact, those rivalries, some of them go back to the prehistoric period, but a lot of them are certainly a result of Spanish colonization and Spanish colonists playing the Pueblos against one another. And most aspects of Rio Grande Pueblo religion remain underground and are not presented to the public. There's a very small subset that are visible to the public. Kind of an example of where we stand today is, of course, Bernalillo fiestas. These will be held on August 10th. In fact, interesting list of the year, they will be held virtually. Like everything else in our world, everybody's going virtual, including the Catholic traditions of my home of Bernalillo. The Festival of St. Lawrence has been held annually since 1693. Why 1693? That's the year they established the town of Bernalillo. They reestablished the settlement, which they now call Bernalillo or Little Bernal. In 1693, it was a promise they made to St. Lawrence, believing that St. Lawrence, August 10th is St. Lawrence's Day, which is the day the Pueblo Revolt of 1680 fell upon, and for sparing the community, for being warned, probably not by St. Lawrence, probably by an indigenous person from a surrounding Pueblo, perhaps at Quawa Pueblo. They were told about it and retreated south and didn't suffer human loss as a result of the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. But they do it in celebration. They do a dance known as La Promesa, and the Motochines dance are done in gratitude for St. Lawrence sparing them. And interestingly enough, the dance that they perform focuses on the conversion of the monarch, in this case Montezuma, to Christendom, and ends with the death of the devil or the heathen. Conclusions. Well, first and foremost, if I take anything, if you don't know what that symbol is in the middle, that's the Franciscan symbol. So we have the symbol of New Mexico, the Zia symbol representing indigenous peoples or Pueblo peoples, Franciscan symbol representing the missionaries, and of course the flag of Spain representing the Spanish colonists. Some people get confused why I choose those three images for the slide. But what are the conclusions? The conclusions are, first of all, conflict occurred, but it was not limited to the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. In fact, the whole entire 17th century was an era of conflict, a century of conflict. And much of this conflict was centered around religion. However, it's not, you can't just say the Spanish were simply intolerant of other belief systems. They themselves had other belief systems. Really, the intolerance and the acts of banning Pueblo religion come out of a hard line drawn by the Franciscans in 1661, which was part of an earlier tradition by MOTOLINA in discussing how indigenous peoples as a whole were going to be treated in the Spanish colonies. And in fact, the evolving dynamic between the priests, Spanish and Pueblos, helped form the New Mexico which exists today. And so now, I always entertain comments and questions. associated with these. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and answer those now. You can always email as far as focus and whatnot. Yes.
Mehdi had a question for you.
Hold on, let me stop sharing my screen and I will come back to all of you. And now I'm here and willing to talk. So Mehdi, what is your question?
She wrote it. Mehdi, do you want to tell him?
Oh, okay. You spoke early on about the diversity of the ethnic diversity of the settlers coming in. And I was wondering how diverse was the population of Spain at that time? And would the typical colonists to New Mexico of diverse ethnicity be comfortable or welcome in Spain? Was there a dichotomy between Spain and the people who were in fact Spanish settlers?
So we can absolutely talk about that. So first of all, how diverse was Spain? Well, you've got to remember that by 1598, the Spanish Empire, so the empire at the time of Philip II, because Philip II actually died in 1598, King Philip II of Spain, King of Portugal, King of all sorts of things, kings of Sicily. He actually had the title of King of Jerusalem too, even though he didn't rule it, which gets into a different thing. His empire included everything from the Philippines to large portions of Italy, to the Netherlands. He was actually king. He was not at 1598. Ireland and England were not part of the Spanish Empire, but earlier on they had been. And many Irish in 1598 lived within the Spanish Empire. German peoples, the Holy Roman Empire was actually separate from Spain at this point, so most of Germany was actually separate. But it was ruled by other people of the Habsburg family, and his wife at the time of his death was the princess of the Holy Roman Empire. It even included places. I mean, the Spanish Empire at this time period had included places all throughout the world, in Africa, through his Portuguese possessions. It included Mozambique. It included, at this point, Brazil was a part of the Spanish Empire. How were these people treated? Well, we don't. Most of the people who settled in northern New Mexico were ostensibly identified as Castilian, which is to say they identified as what we would call Spanish today. However, that's not all of them. And in fact, many place names in New Mexico are remembered because they weren't settled by Castilians. For example, the Alman Ranch, or the Ailman Ranch along the Camino Real is a famous paraje along the route. It's known as the Alman Ranch, or the Ailman Ranch, because the person who settled there was Alemanni, which is the word for German. There were many German settlers amongst the peoples of New Mexico. There were many peoples who would not have viewed themselves up until very recently as Castilians. Castile, the kingdom of Castile, as it existed, as was managed under the Council of Castile in 1598, included not only the Castilian provinces, but it included the Basque province of Navarre and the formerly Muslim province of Granada. So the lands of Granada were managed under the Council of Castile. So these are portions of the empire. But most importantly, and the thing I cannot stress enough, is that if we were looking at the overwhelming majority of people in the Spanish Empire, they were not European, African, or Asian at all. They were actually indigenous peoples from other portions of the New World. King Philip had more indigenous subjects, peoples that may have spoken some form of Castilian Spanish, but that were ostensibly, in terms of their genetic makeup, entirely Nahua. They were Mayan peoples. They were Incan peoples. They were a variety of Native American peoples in the New World. And these peoples, through their mixing with Spanish ancestry, were the true colonizers of New Mexico. In fact, the reason we get the term New Mexico, Nuevo Mexico, is it was supposed to be the new, other portions of the empire had been called Nuevo Galicia. But New Mexico was called New Mexico because they thought it was going to be the new Valley of Mexico. You got to remember, they're all focused on the Rio Grande Valley. Now, you'd have to squint pretty hard to get the Valley of Mexico and New Mexico confused necessarily. But it's all fairness to the settlers. Nahuatl tradition had been that the Aztecs came from the north. And many of them believed, certainly during the times of Coronado and later, believed, sung the praises that they were returning to the Aztlan, the home of the Aztec people. In fact, this was so heavily believed that when the U.S. Army came in 1849, many Pueblo peoples recited verbatim from Spanish ideas that they were actually Aztec ancestors. Confusing. Yes, they're not Aztec ancestors, and that's completely focused. But it shows how these mythologies come to pass and time goes on. So it's very important to see the Spanish settlers as a mixture. But it's also important to recognize that no matter what their genetic makeup was, whether the Hispanic colonists of New Mexico contained primarily indigenous blood, many of them viewed themselves as not only the legacy of the Spanish Empire, but the legacy of the Roman Empire. And we see that with these HIGAS that are adorning their bodies. They view themselves as a continuation of the great Western European empires that existed since late antiquity. These are proud, these are the Roman emperors. This is, when you look at Santa Fe, to them, you should see the same peoples that had marched across the, what at the time was the globe, but in reality, the Mediterranean world. They were the people. In fact, the Spanish kings had regularly celebrated in the same ways Roman emperors had done that over 1,000 years before. So that's a long explanation, but certainly an important question, actually. Okay, other questions?
Question. You made a comment about how Kachinas were somehow associated with saint images. Was that brought on more by the native people or the Spanish trying to learn their other religion or more about the other religion?
We
Who's
don't.
the one that initiated that?
We don't. So I'm going to tell you, because the accounts are so sporadic, we can't tell if it was indigenous people initiating that comparison or if it was the Franciscan priests. It certainly wasn't the Spanish colonists. All of these, the few accounts we have of this occurring, where we know it actually did occur to some extent, they occur in Franciscan missions. So very likely it was either initiated by the Native American peoples themselves or by the Franciscan priests that were trying to convert them. The success rate of the conversions associated with this time period are actually quite astounding if you believe the Franciscans themselves. Now, it should be noted, and I don't mean this to bash the Franciscans, they come out as kind of like bad guys in this lecture, and they're really not. But they're also trying to put forward a really positive view of what they're doing in New Mexico. So most of the accounts we have by Franciscan missionaries in New Mexico, and primarily I'm thinking in terms of Benavides's account in 1630, these are propaganda. These pieces of propaganda. They're meant to make the Franciscans look really good in what they're doing. So they're overinflating probably the number of conversions, or perhaps, and maybe I'm being a cynic here, perhaps you will accept Christ into your heart if it means you get to eat that day, not necessarily because you accept Christ into your heart. And that's very cynical, obviously, but certainly for peoples that needed access to things, and not just access to food. With the Spanish coming in, access to metal tools to work their fields and all of these things were very important. You might attend church to gain access to these things, whether you believe it or not.
Okay. Do you have any kind of like resources, or that's something very of great interest to me. So I don't know if you know of any books or resources that talk about how they kind of associated Cachinas with Santos? Or
There's no huge resource. If you want brief mentions of it in Spanish documents, absolutely. Email me and I'll be happy to
Okay.
get you those two.
Thank you.
The idea that there's an elaborate discussion of it is not that. I mean, there might be. I mean, so many documents, and this is important to point out. The time period I'm talking about is in many ways really document sparse. Most of the documents, they may exist in Spain or Mexico City, but they were burned at the Palace of the Governors. We don't have a lot of the records that were kept in New Mexico during the 17th century. So this has made archaeological research all the more important. So a lot of the examples I've given are based upon archaeological data. We looked at the Siege of Santa Fe. We looked at archaeological materials that I talked about briefly. The archival documents, realistically, when I say Durrani Chavez leads the putting down of the revolt in 1623, it should be noted the words given were not that he put down the revolt in 1623, but that he was honored as Maestro de Campo for his services, which is the head military guy in New Mexico, for his services in that year. We have to actually do some investigative work to say, oh yeah, look, that's the same time period there that church is burning in Jemez. It looks like he's probably the one who went out there or organized the putting down of that revolt. Or if I say Tewa peoples were used in that reconquest, it doesn't really say that. Rather, Benavides says, in 1630, he said, well, the Tewa were really helpful in getting some things resolved, and they were great warriors. It doesn't actually say, oh yeah, the cacique from San Ildefonso marched out with 300 men to go into the Jemez Mountains to stop the Jemez from fighting. In fact, the Spanish don't even report that there was a revolt. They report that the Jemez got angry against other Jemez and that there was a Jemez civil war that they needed to stop. These are not accounts that necessarily point to the importance of these things. It's also important to mention that we are almost, I would say with absolute certainty, that revolts were very numerous and that there are conflicts between the indigenous peoples of New Mexico and the Spanish that we have absolutely no record of whatsoever, because the Spanish didn't want to report on them, they were put down quickly, or some other reason. There were many reasons why you did not want to send a letter back saying things were going badly in New Mexico, especially when the colony was, in many people's views, underperforming as it was. You did not want to say those kind of things. So you tended to focus on the good things. How many people went to church?
Matt, I have a quick question back to those saints. Can you comment a bit on the pueblos that adopted saintly names, Santa Ana, San Juan, and then subsequently, recently, those pueblos that have abandoned those names?
Okay, so it should be noted that first and foremost, adopting saintly names is a bit of a misnomer. If somebody comes to you and says, you're San Jose, you're the Pueblo of San Jose, and you're the Pueblo of Santa Clara, that doesn't mean you adopted the name. What it means is somebody assigned you a name or decided that something they saw there made them think of that particular saint or not. It should be noted that all of the, in fact, it can be hard sometimes to identify them. First of all, every Pueblo native Pueblo that received a mission was given a saintly name. And in fact, nobody referred to Jemez historic site. It is be noted that even though Jemez people refer to it as Gisela, there are no Spanish documents that talk about a village of Gisela. They call the village San Jose or San Jose Pueblo. They're all named after their missions, their respective missions. So if Saint Joseph is going to be the saint in which the mission at Gisela is dedicated to, the village becomes San Jose. If the mission at Kewa is going to be associated with Saint Dominic, then we will get Santo Domingo, and so on and so forth. They are not, they're not, in fact, Walatoa, Carente Jemez Pueblo was known as San Diego Pueblo in Spanish documents. These are, so people reclaiming their ancestral names or choosing, in some cases, whether they were the ancestral names or not, it's irrelevant. Indigenous ownership of their own lands and using indigenous names to represent their places is perfectly fine. Their peoples would have always done so, and we have unfortunately in English adopted the Spanish, the Westernized tradition. So we simply adopted the Spanish names for these places almost wholesale. In many cases, these names are problematic. So what I'm saying is, don't necessarily, just because it's got a saint's name, they didn't choose which saint they loved the most, and then no, unfortunately, no. That would be a nice story.
I suspected that. Thank you, Matt.
Yeah, and in fact, if there's anything we can get from all this violence that happens in the 17th century, what I would hope you take away more than all is that a little bit of religious tolerance goes a long way. And the deaths, the hardships could have been, you know, they had their most successes when they were being accepting of one another. And as that kind of ground to a halt, especially under Posada, who's largely forgotten by history, but really did a horrible thing by banning the worship of Cachinas, indigenous religion, led to a lot of hardship in New Mexico. And I would hope that in today's world, speaking not in New Mexico, but all across the globe, that we can all be religiously tolerant and accepting of other people and their belief systems. There's no more questions. Oh, Mehdi has a question.
After the Reconquest, you talked about lands being assigned settlers and then also lands assigned Pueblo people, right?
Yeah.
Are those the first land grants? I had read someplace that records for some of the land grants had been destroyed in 1680. Can you talk about that?
No, there were earlier land grants. To be very clear, there were very early land grants. And the land grants, in fact, if you were to take New Mexico as a whole, anybody who says, I've mapped out the land grants for New Mexico or something like that, or they show you a map of land grants in New Mexico, it's not good. It's not good. Anybody who tries to give you a simplified version with lines on a map is wrong. And the reason for that is the land grants overlap with one another in multiple instances, and land grants changed based on years. Now, I said that the Spanish colonists were literally living in a feudal society. They absolutely were. And so if you take that idea of a feudal society and you put the governor as the king, then all the local lords, the Spanish colonists, their lands were determined by whether they were in favor of the governor or whether they were not in favor of the governor. The governor changed, and they don't elect the governor. The governor gets sent in. So a new regime would come in. They'd have to curry favor. If you were too close to the old regime, you lost your lands. If they were rivals with the old regime and they were in with the new guy that came in, they'd get more lands. The land grant situation really changed a lot. In fact, Bernalillo is named after potentially the Bernal land grant, but Durrani Chavez's land grant, which preceded that, extended perhaps all the way from San Felipe Pueblo, from Tonqué down to southern Albuquerque. It was a big land grant for a couple of years. And all the people in there, the colonists and stuff like that, they were part of his land grant. He got to determine he was the lord of the land in there. That didn't last. It got broke apart real quickly. It doesn't hold up. Unfortunately, the fortunes of the Spanish families here were really tied to politics. And it could be a very hard system sometimes.
Okay, but the natives who were given land grants or land that had the same challenges relative to who was in power, and okay.
Absolutely. And in fact, those land grants, so those lands given to the Pueblo peoples, form the basis for the tribal lands that are recognized by the U.S. government for their reservations. Okay. So roughly, and I do mean this very roughly, because those lands have shrunk over time, the lands which Sandia, for example, live upon today, the lands of Isleta live upon today roughly equate to the land recognized by the Spanish crown in the colonial period, if that makes sense at all. So that's not true of other Native American groups. For example, the lands of the Navajo Nation have no colonial precedent. But in the case of the Rio Grande Pueblos, even Acoma, for example, those lands which Acoma holds, and they have changed some, and now they're expanding again as tribes work to reclaim traditional lands controlled by the federal government. Those lands are primarily the lands granted to them earlier under Spanish authority.
Thank you.
Fascinating. Matt, there's been so much interest in Oñate of late. Can you tell us what happened to him when he left?
Yeah, so nothing bad. You know, you'd like to think, well, if he's a bad person, something bad happened to him. No, it really didn't. In fact, the key takeaway from Oñate, and it should be noted that this is Oñate, Juan de Oñate, he actually came from an earlier family. In fact, he prospered. His dad had prospered at Coronado's misfortunes up here in New Mexico. Cristobal Oñate had discovered silver, was one of the people who discovered silver in Zacatecas. His family became very, very wealthy. He was handpicked as the guy to lead the colony up here because it was thought, you know, he's a genius. His family's geniuses at mining. This is going to be a wealthy mineral province. They're going to make all sorts of money up here. Oñate doesn't find it. He finds the colonists are really needy up here. He doesn't need the headache. In fact, he goes back down to live out the rest of his days in uber wealth, in luxury, in central Mexico, and he becomes mining inspector for all of New Spain. So he goes around and he actually tells people what they're doing right and what they're doing wrong in mining. He actually grew wise pretty quickly that he was not going to find the wealth he needed to make an additional fortune up here in New Mexico, and he left. The Oñate family, interestingly enough, is not necessarily tied to the fortunes of New Mexico. If you were to look at a positive Spanish figure, and in a sense, from a colonial point of view, this is a horrible thing. Well, not the most tolerant, but certainly a man who believed in New Mexico. You're probably better focused on de Vargas as a person who really wanted to see New Mexico succeed. Now, in all fairness, de Vargas really wanted to be governor of Guatemala. He really didn't want to necessarily be governor of New Mexico, but he died in service to the crown in New Mexico. It's not like he went off to lead. And in fact, he died. Well, he died of probably dysentery, but he died on campaign against Native American or indigenous peoples. He literally, for whatever reason, the cliques for him were absolute war. He's going to bring this colony back, and he fought for what he believed in. Yes. Wasn't
Oñate replaced by Peralta?
Yes.
And Oñate was in disgrace of sorts?
Well, he's in disgrace, but he's still super uber wealthy. I mean, he goes down and yeah, that's what I'm saying. The New Mexico narrative, he was a bad manager and he was kicked out. Oh no, he had to go back to his nice hacienda, his huge hacienda in Zacatecas. And instead of living in some poor village where they were trying to barely meek out a going of it, he had hundreds of servants attending to his every needs. Oh no, poor Oñate in that case. And I mean that humorously, obviously, of course. But certainly, as far as figures go, Oñate turned out just fine. Now, it was under Peralta that the Spanish capital, the colonial capital, was going to move to Santa Fe in the first place. Peralta did a lot to shape the early colonial framework of New Mexico. Certainly, a lot of Spanish governors worked in many different ways. But yes, the idea that he left in disgrace, yes, it's perfect. Just like it's easy to say, well, Oñate founded the colony, or Coronado was the first explorer in New Mexico. These are oversimplifications of bigger issues. And history is never that simple. It's very complex and very challenging. And even still here, while I tried to present examples and give you a much more complicated narrative than perhaps the one you're accustomed to, I would hope you'd understand that even still then, I'm simplifying things a great deal. I have to. I mean, it took 100 years for these events pretty much to play out, if you want to look at it that way. There's no way I can summarize in an hour-long presentation what occurred over the course of 100 years. All right, with that, I think we are done. I'm going to pass off.
I have a quick question, Matt.
Yes, I'll answer one more question, and I'll try to be brief.
Speaking of Oñate, you call it the Oñate colony, and I like that. But like the Albuquerque Museum, their plaques have it as the Oñate expedition. Is there why is one called expedition? Why is
so my use of the word colony has to do with the way I'm as we grow as archaeologists and historians, we recalibrate our thoughts on things. One of the things that makes more sense to me today, and perhaps I see as the next narrative for New Mexico history, is to look at the Spanish colony in New Mexico is actually 3 distinct colonies. Now, have I written about this, or do I know of anybody who's really written about this in great deal? In fact, Homer Milford, who's passed away now, I'll give him credit. He talked about this at great length before anybody else did. And the reality is because he loved the Cerrillos Hills. So one of the better ways, perhaps, that I would argue to think about New Mexico is to look at it as 3 distinct colonies. You have the Sosa colony of 1590, 1591. That is the slave colony. That's the colony that's focused on mining in the Cerrillos. You have Oñate's colony, which is, I would guesstimate the Encomienda colony. It's the colony in which you're going to see large impressment of Native American peoples. You're going to see the establishment of huge missions as corporate ventures to capitalize on the indigenous labor. And then you have de Vargas's colony, which is the colony of subsistence farmers and the colony that survives to this day. And the reason I would argue those are 3 separate colonies is if you look at what they're doing in those 3 colonies, it's very different from one another. The colony of Sosa is slavers, and it's industrial production. It's let's make as much silver as we possibly can. Let's sell the indigenous labor. The second colony is associated with big farms and big haciendas. The Vargas colony, the third colony, I believe is very different. De Vargas's colonists, the people who returned to New Mexico and the new people that come into the 18th century, are associated with just having a living up here. They still want to be Spanish nobility. Obviously, they want a good life for themselves. But their farming holdings are much smaller. Their use of indigenous labor is much more minuscule. Their settlements are dispersed. Their colonies not governed by militaristic prowess. In fact, in many ways, they're a defensive colony. They're instead of looking to expand the colonial framework, they're looking at making sure their holdings are defended against raids from Athabascan peoples and things like that. So I think you could actually say, you could actually make a case that New Mexico is actually 3 Spanish colonies. The place we call New Mexico was actually 3 different Spanish colonies. And so for me, the Sosa colony, the Oñate colony, and the de Vargas colony kind of represent that division. Oñate as an expedition could also, you could even further break it down. You could say Oñate's colony was really San Juan Pueblo. It was at San Juan de los Caballeros. You know, you could split it up any way you want. But I think those 3 major divisions are really good. And with that, I have definitely gone over my time today. Thank you very much. You were a wonderful audience today.
Thank you, Matt.
I look forward to seeing you guys all in 2 weeks. Bye.
Thank you.